All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to be talking about the Genestealer cults in particular. I've got my speaker notes up here and I've got some notes in here just to make sure I do things all correctly. So mainly going to be talking about millennialism specifically, which is a form of eschatology that's sort of post-apocalyptic, but maybe more of the brighter future version of post-apocalypticism. To get started, I wanted to give just a brief definition of what millennialism is. And, maybe it's not quite appropriate to use dictionary definitions for an academic talk, but I wanted to give something. So the word millennialism comes from the belief expressed in the book of Revelation to John, the last book in the New Testament, that Christ will establish 1,000-year reign of the saints on the earth, which is the millennium, right before the last judgment. So it's sort of this idea that Christ will return and establish this wonderful, paradise on this planet before the actual end times, right? This has been expanded quite a bit by scholars. And sort of a good definition for this is the belief in a coming ideal society, and especially one created by revolutionary action. Right. And I do want to mention, too, that this talk is sort of based on this wonderful paper called The Deadly Pursuit by Bernard Doherty. So it's sort of structured in a similar way. Now, we have that definition, but one of the things that I looked at and I think is quite useful is this book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is by Norman Cohn. And he has a 5-step sort of criteria for determining whether or not a movement is a millennialist movement or not. Okay. And so we're going to take a look at each one of those. What's interesting is that this came from the revised edition in the preface, because the first edition of this book, he did not actually define what millennialism was. He just started talking about it in terms of new religious movements and religious revolutions in Western Europe. So the first thing that Cohn identifies is that it must be collective, in the sense that is to be enjoyed by the faithful as a collectivity. So this is not an individual salvation. This is going to take control of everyone that is faithful, and potentially everyone on the planet, right? In the same way that you can think that sin might disqualify people from heaven, same way that sin or a lack of belief might disqualify someone from being able to enjoy the material realization of that on the planet. I think this is really important for the Genestealer cults in particular, since their first codex came out. And I want to highlight work of Asa Timonen and Ian Sturrock, who presented last year a paper called The Diverging Political Paradigm of Warhammer 40,000, where they actually were doing a close reading of the Genestealer cults all throughout Warhammer 40K history. And they found that in older editions, before they got their own codices, they were sort of coded as what I would call American televangelists. They had rules for limousines. They were somewhat considered respected members of a planet society, that they were one particular way of worshiping the emperor, but not necessarily one that was so out there that it couldn't be integrated in. But since the Codex came out, we see this more working class visual language being used. And I think that ties into this millennialist idea of collectivity, right? So sort of borrowing 21st century ideas and 20th century ideas of what a collective group looks like and mapping it onto kind of a religious sect, right? Yeah. Now, James Reinhardt, he wrote a book called Millennialism and Revolution, in which he argues that revolution is emboldened by millennialist beliefs that a society might already have, right? And so this is one of the quotes. On the one hand, revolution embodies the extreme side of socio-political behavior in the sense that through such a process, humankind explicitly seeks to thoroughly and radically transform the institutions and values of society. On the other hand, if we define ideology as a doctrine regarding the right and wrong ways in which social power and authority can be used and in what direction society should be headed, then millennialism or millenarianism must be understood to be ideology in its most extreme form. So Reinhardt is making the argument that both of these things sit at the very extremes of both of these axes, right? He goes further and argues that millennialism actually provides three functions for revolutionaries, that in order for a revolution to be successful, it needs these three things, and that millennialism actually provides these three things. It's a preparatory function in that it prepares the people of the society for taking the reins of their own destiny and maybe overthrowing whatever government or sociopolitical forces are pressed down on them. It provides a leadership function in that it allows for someone to establish themselves as a voice for the movement, or someone, speaking for God or star children in this case. And it also provides a therapeutic function, as in it will allow people to work through some of the more uncomfortable things that come with revolution, right? Cohn also has this idea that millennialism is for millennialism to take hold, you need what he calls the disoriented poor, what we might think of like the masses, right? And specifically, he thinks that it's not enough that people have terrible lives or anything like that, but then something has to happen, whether that be plague, volcanic eruption, some other kind of natural effect. It could be the Industrial Revolution, right? Anything that upsets people's normal social order and how they understand the world, right? And this is a quote from him again and again: in situations of mass disorientation and anxiety, traditional beliefs about a future golden age or messianic kingdom come to serve as vehicles for social aspirations and animosities, right? He goes a step further in his book and argues that it actually becomes a mass psychosis is what causes millennialism, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's certainly one way to look at it. Now, we're finally going to turn it to the Genestealer cults a little more here, right? So if we look at the idea of the disoriented poor, generally, the Genestealer cults find their foothold in the downtrodden, in the underclass, right? Sort of the cracks of society is how it's typically portrayed. So there are already people that are on the fringes that are what we consider the poor, right? In ours. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that they do have a disorientation event, and that is the Genestealer actually arriving on their planet, right? So this species of alien is not only taking advantage of sort of this apocalyptic belief, but actually instigating it in some very explicit ways. Here, I do want to talk. So, the idea is that a Genestealer comes down, finds a host, and does the Genestealer kiss to infect, and it does sort of this brainwashing technique, maybe some brain stimulation kind of thing. One of the things I found in my research for all of this is that brainwashing is not actually considered a serious theory when it comes to studying cults and new religious movements, that it's been sort of debunked, at least in the academic literature, although people still like to talk about it and still like to use it. We'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, but I just want to get that out there right now, that brainwashing is not actually a serious academic pursuit. Okay, so that's the first thing that Cohn identifies, right? The collectivity. The second one is that it is terrestrial, in the sense that it is not, that is to be realized on this earth and not in some otherworldly heaven. So to be a millennialist movement, it has to affect this planet with all of us on it still, with all the animals and all of that, right? And while there is some talk in like Genestealer literature of maybe joining the star children and going and helping to infect other planets, they are primarily focused on their own planet, which is something that I find quite interesting. I think fits into this model quite well, right? That they are interested in improving their stations at their home planet, not going further and kind of taking over the whole galaxy, right? The third thing that Cohn identifies is that it is imminent, in the sense that it is to come both soon and suddenly. Sort of the idea that no one can predict when the end times is going to come, but perhaps everyone sort of feels it all the time. So this quote from Day of Ascension: "It is not time She said again, I listen, child, every night. I listen to the singing of the emperor's angels. They are closer, I know. They hear our hymns and know we are faithful, but it is not time yet. And you see this repeated over and over in this book, that they don't know when it's going to happen, but they expect it to come soon, and they want to be ready for it no matter what. The fourth is that it needs to be total, in the sense that it is utterly to transform life on Earth, so that the new dispensation is not just a mere improvement on the present, but perfection itself. So whatever happens to this planet will be perfect, right? Whatever the revolution creates will be an ideal society. And that's sort of a needed belief in order to kick off a millennialist belief, right? Or movement. Okay. This can be recognized as sort of a return to a prehistoric or idyllic state. So again, from Day of Ascension, I long for it, he said, an end to work, an end to pain, a return to the arms of our blessed Father. Isn't that what we used to say when we were young? We see this play out in millennialist movements, sort of the Anabaptist movements, and movements even earlier, like the Brethren of the Free Spirit. This idea that we're going to return to the Garden of Eden, right? That before private property was even a thing, there were even during the Anabaptist rebellions, there was this idea that the building of the Tower of Babel was the creation of private property, and that we were all better off before it. With sayings like "onio sunt communia," right? Everything held in common. A lot of these movements had a pseudo-communist bent where they would share everything in common. And I think you see that a little bit in the Genestealer. Certainly they are coded as collective, right? There's also this idea that perhaps in the new society, religious members will rule after the inciting incident, right? The Doomsday event. So Aum Shinrikyo, which was a Japanese new religious movement, most famous for the 1995 sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway. Their beliefs were predicated on a lot of, thrown together beliefs from like John the Baptist and things like that, where they predicted that a nuclear war was going to occur and that they were going to be the chosen ones to lead society after that, that they would have a stronghold in the mountains, they would come out, and that they would, be the rulers of the new world. And finally, Cohn identifies as his fifth, miraculous, in the sense that it is to be accomplished by or with the help of supernatural agencies. And this is where there's sort of this divergence between the religious study of millennialism and this broader view of millennialism of revolution, right? Where revolution tends to speak to the people themselves, that they need to take up arms and they need to go and be masters of their own destiny, whereas like a religious millennialist belief needs this otherworldly power to come down. And of course, with the Genestealers, we know that this, for them, is the Star Children, is the Tyranids. One of the great tragedies of the Genestealer cults, of course, is that these are not actually angels. These are not envoys of the Empire. These are an alien race that is coming to consume everyone, right? And again, from Day of Ascension, you're making a mistake. He told her hoarsely, the things you want to call out to, they will consume you. They're not angels, they're monsters. Her face was beautifully calm when she answered him, what makes you think, she said, that they are two different things? So even if the cracks are somewhat forming for the Genestealers, they still choose to worship the Tyranids, even if they know that it's not going to work for them. To that point, there are ideas of secular miraculous apocalypses, right? So Aum Shinrikyo, of course, believed it was a nuclear war. The family, Charles Manson, famously believed that it was going to be a race war in America, that it was actually going to be, black people and white people kill all of each other until there were only a small population left. And then the family would again emerge and kind of rule over. So they create these secular apocalypses for these millennialist movements. Another side of all of this is this idea that that these millennialist movements are heresy, right? And specifically that they can be rebellion against the dominant religion. We see this play out quite a bit in history with, again, the Anabaptist revolution or rebellions, where they actually identify the Catholic Church as the prophesied whore of Babylon that needs to be usurped in order to establish the 1,000-year reign, right? Even going so far as, it's God's will to kill nuns and priests and take churches and things like that. And I think you can see that represented in the Genestealer cults quite well, right? So they take revolutionary action, trying to kill priests. In Day of Ascension, they're struggling against the Mechanicus, right? So actually trying to kill the overseers of the planet in order to take over. Okay. Something that I came across with my research that I think really is important to emphasize with all of this, though, is with the Tyranid, with the Genestealer cults in particular, that while there are examples of real world movements in these sort of ways, and certainly for millennialism, but from our popular culture understanding of cults in particular, they don't really map to reality most of the time. So most of us, we have this idea of cults as a very strong leader that is brainwashing people and is starving people and very charismatic, and people can't leave and coerced and all of this, and that's just not true. We have these very big examples, Amish-Enriquio, Jonestown, right, where those are sort of exceptions that prove the rule. Most new religious movements are fairly benign. People tend to only stay in for a matter of months, maybe 10 months, 12 months is sort of the average. But we kind of keep in mind these big explosive ones. So this term comes from Scott Different, who was looking at representations of new religious movements in media and sort of how our popular culture understands them. What's nice about this, the cult imaginary, as he calls it, is it does give us a shorthand for talking about things, right? And certainly Games Workshop uses that shorthand quite a bit. That's why they're called the Genestealer cults and not Genestealer new religious movements, even though that's a more accurate term, right? Because they want to tap into that fear. They want to tap into those ideas. We can even go to think, we talked a little bit about brainwashing. So the Genestealer kiss, essentially brainwashing an individual into believing in the Star Children and the Tyranids coming. But it goes even further than that, where they get psychic powers that they're able to communicate with each other. And Dave essentially even talk about the elders being able to kind of force beliefs and tug beliefs through, which I kind of read as a take on the charismatic leader ordering people around, right? But know that this does not actually comport with most new religious movements, right? So that is all I have. We've got quite a bit of time for questions. I do want to give a thanks to Scott Harrower and Christopher Porter. So my research is going to appear in this Theology, Religion, and Warhammer 40,000 book. So this is a small part of my research for that. So if you're interested in a little bit more of an expanded look, please look for that coming out. My edits are due the middle of this month, or next month, rather. Yeah, so we'll open up for questions.